May it please the court. I just love it when people say that now. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Bill Coons. I am a United States District Court judge from the Eastern District of New York, and I have the honor of serving as the moderator of this panel. When Dean asked me if I would do this, I said, I really don't know anything about minimum wage increases, increasing earnings for millions of workers, and boosting the bottom line of businesses. Who could be against it? And he said, well, yes, we know that, Bill, but since you're a United States District Court judge, the fact that you don't know anything should not preclude you from being very entertaining and forceful in your presentation. And who was I to disagree? We have a very distinguished panel from whom you will learn a great deal. On November 6th of this year, a brief editorial appeared in the paper that General Jerry Wolpin says shall not speak its name. We'll just call it the New York Times, at page A30, and it was captioned, "In red and blue states, good ideas prevail." The editorial, after noting that, and I quote, "The Democratic brand did not fare well, to put it mildly, in congressional and governor's races on Tuesday." But it then went on to write this about the minimum wage. Quote, "Initiatives to raise the minimum wage appeared on the ballots in 4 deep red states, Alaska, Arkansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota, and passed in all of them. The new hourly minimum ranged from $8.50 in Arkansas by 2017 to $9.75 in Alaska by 2016. Minimum wage increases were also approved in, I take it this is not a deep red state, San Francisco to $15 an hour by 2018, and Oakland to $12.25 by 2015. In all, an estimated 609,000 low-wage workers will see raises from these approved increases. In addition, voters in Illinois and in several cities and counties in Wisconsin approved non-binding measures calling for minimums of $10 or more. If legislators follow through on the voters' will, 1.1 million workers in those states would see raises. The latest increases bring to 29 the number of states that exceed or will soon exceed the paltry federal minimum, their words, not mine, the paltry federal minimum of $7.25 an hour, which has been in place since 2009. They underscore the broad support for higher minimums and suggest that Republicans who continue to oppose a higher federal minimum could pay a price in the 2016 elections, when lower wage workers and those who support them could turn out in higher numbers," close quote. Well, let us now hear from our distinguished panel. We begin with the learned Professor David Weil, the Distinguished Administrator of the Wage and Hour Division. He will be followed by Ms. Diana Furchtgott-Roth, former Chief Economist of the U.S. Department of Labor and Senior Fellow and Director of Economics, 21, at the Manhattan Institute. Then we will hear from Mr. Ross Eisenbrey, Vice President of Economic Policy, a lawyer and former Commissioner of the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. And finally, from Karen R. Harnett, Esquire, the Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Business, Small Business Legal Center. Given the nature of what I do in my day job, I will continue to hog the podium and ruthlessly apply the time limits. But I will say nothing of any substance because that is my role, and I do it very well. So with that, Professor, you're on.
Thank you, Judge Coons, for the introduction. Thank you to the Federalist Society for inviting me to participate. It's always nice to hear myself referred to as professor. It reminds me of my former life. I was a professor of Economics at Boston University's School of Management, and they ran a center studying transparency at the Harvard Kennedy School for many, many years. But 6 months ago, I was honored to be confirmed by the United States Senate as the Wage and Hour Administrator, the first Wage and Hour Administrator in 10 years to be confirmed by the Senate. And my predecessor, who I keep seeing at conferences, Tammy McCutcheon, was the last Wage and Hour Administrator confirmed at the beginning of the Bush administration. So I've seen this issue as an academic and now in my responsibilities in overseeing the Wage and Hour Division, which is responsible for enforcement of minimum wage and overtime laws. And a number of different statutes, all based on the premise of protecting labor standards in our labor markets and to protect workers who are in the United States with the enforcement of those standards. I have thought about, as I said, as someone trained in labor economics and who studied workplace policy for most of my career, I've thought a lot about both the policy itself and the enforcement of that policy. When you sit in my chair, as Tammy well knows, the issue takes on an additional vibrancy because you're dealing with often cases where people have not been paid what is, as Judge Kuhn's quoting the New York Times says, is a very low standard, which I want to talk about in some detail now, in terms of the compensation it provides workers as our minimum wage standard. So what I'd like to do is work through why the minimum wage, I would argue, is a foundation of workplace policy, talk specifically about President Obama's proposal and its impact, then speak about what I would regard, what I'm going to argue is the minimum wage as a policy with intended consequences. I think it is a remarkable policy in that it actually meets many of the basic standards and objectives that it sets out to achieve. And then finally, I want to speak some, again, maybe echoing what Judge Kuhn's was raising, a number of different courts of public opinion that have concurred with the fact that we are well beyond the time when we should have raised the minimum wage, and this certainly is an important policy we should consider very soon. So let me start with the minimum wage as a foundation, workplace foundation policy. And I would argue that minimum wage plays a particularly critical role in the workplace and in setting baseline standards about what is the floor of behavior that we find acceptable in the most fundamental policy of the labor market, and that's compensation. There are a lot of policies and wage structures that build on the minimum wage, particularly in our low-wage labor markets. And those low-wage labor markets, both occupationally and in terms of industries, are some of our fastest-growing labor markets. So it is particularly important to think about the impact of a policy like minimum wage, given the number of workers who are currently covered and will prospectively be covered as the labor market continues to expand in the directions we've seen in the last few years. As a benchmark for wage structures in low-wage labor markets, it's a referent wage, and so when that referent wage is set at a very low level, it not only has impacts on the workers directly receiving those wages, but those who are also in wage structures immediately above that. And because of that, that in itself says if that floor has drifted too far below where it should be, it not only affects those directly in that band, but wage structures above it. I would also say that as a baseline standard related to compensation, and because of its importance in setting wider workplace standards, we have to think hard about what it means when it does drift too far below and the kinds of impacts that has on other workplace policies, which I'm happy to talk about in our general discussions. I would argue that both the level of the minimum wage and in patterns of violations in particular industries we see where the minimum wage is particularly salient, I would argue there is a lot of peripheral effects that we should also be concerned about. But let's talk about the specifics of minimum wage as a floor of compensation. President Obama articulates the moral basis of minimum wage related to it as a foundation of workplace policy very clearly when he says no one in this country should work full-time and be below the poverty level. And if you calculate what the annual earnings of someone who is working the minimum wage would be relative to the poverty level, it would set a family of four about 17% below what we define as the poverty level in this country. And that's including tax credits for a low-wage, low-income family like that. So the level itself is currently at a set that violates this basic principle that people, if they're working hard, working full-time, should certainly be able to support their family above what we've described as the poverty level. So that gets to the President's proposal. The President's proposal, as everyone well knows, is to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, and then also to index the wage so that this problem of the ever-falling nature of the minimum wage when it's linked to current dollars rather than constant dollars becomes something that is annually adjusted appropriately. A move to a 10-10 minimum wage would benefit a total of 28 million workers, those who would directly receive it and also those in the wage structure directly above it. It would directly lift 2 million people out of poverty for the kinds of households that I described a moment ago. It would, in contrast to sometimes it's characterized, it would benefit predominantly people who are not teenagers. 88% of the people who we estimate would receive benefits from the 10-10 minimum wage are above 20 years old, and more than 50% are older than 30. 55% of the recipients of the proposed minimum wage are women. So it would affect a lot of people. It is not just a benefit for the teenage worker trying to find extra money to pay for the car. Quite the opposite. It's a fundamental part of an income source for a lot of working families across the country. And it would add $5,700 extra per year to the incomes of low-income families. And again, if you think about the household budgets of families earning less than $20,000, that's an enormous impact on their well-being. That's often for families who are affected or who are receiving the minimum wage, the difference between rent money, utility money, fixing a car so someone can continue in employment, and so on. So on the merits, I would argue that the President's proposal moves us substantially in the kind of direction that we would hope to achieve through a labor standards as fundamental as the minimum wage. Now, in terms of the minimum wage as a policy with intended consequences, here I call on the scholarship of just a wide array of economists. And if you've hung out with economists, you know that they are a group of people who believe in data, believe in a tough analysis of that data, and are seldomly of a unanimous opinion on anything. And yet we have 7 Nobel laureates in economics and over 600 prominent economists who have come out in support of the President's proposal. And they do so because I think if you look at a number, 5 dimensions of the minimum wage, it passes the kinds of tests that economists and people interested in public policy would assign to it. First of all, it does raise the earnings of those at the minimum wage who are right at the boundary of the current minimum wage. There's not adjustment out of it, particularly if you have robust enforcement of those laws. It also has been shown in numerous studies to raise wages for those immediately above the minimum wage, that band above, and moving that group forward. And again, many different studies have documented this effect. Of course, one of the big things that I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about in the next hour is its impact on employment. And they're going back to a famous study by Alan Kruger, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and David Card, 2 of the most prominent labor economists in the country, I would indeed say in the world, have shown originally, and there has been just an enormous literature since that has shown negligible effects of the minimum wage in many of those studies, including a recent book that's a meta-analysis of the data, basically statistically indistinguishable effects, indistinguishable from a zero effect on the policy. So the employment effects are modest at best and probably close to zero in many of the studies that have been done. Fourth, it reduces turnover. One of the beneficial effects of minimum wage, how do you get both higher wages and low employment and hours effects? It's because businesses adjust. I've taught economics in a business school. I've taught thousands of MBAs, and one of the things we teach them is to be creative, particularly in response to changes in price structures of inputs. Minimum wage is a change. If we raise the minimum wage, businesses will do what businesses do all the time in terms of cost structures. They adjust. They think of new ways to make their products better, differently, manage their operations in a more efficient ways. And again, the literature says, this isn't just talking, the literature says where there have been minimum wage impacts or increases relative to comparable places that haven't experienced those increases, you have increases in productivity, you have lower rates of both accessions and separations, that is turnover of the labor market, and when you have lower turnover in the labor market, you have better investment in workers, improved productivity, and beneficial effects in the labor market structure in general. And then finally, and while I'm not a macroeconomist, there is a David Weil at Brown who is a macroeconomist, so I always cite him when I'm talking about macroeconomics. The marginal propensity to consume, to conjure up an old phrase from your economics courses, is higher for lower income groups. So that means if you put more money in the pockets, if you put the $5,500 I just mentioned in the pocket, particularly of lower income groups, they go out and spend it, and that means more money in the economy, more demand, more money for businesses, and ultimately better macroeconomic outcomes generally. So those are the reasons why I would say it's a policy with intended consequences, and the world recognizes this. And again, Judge Kuntz has cited something I was going to put on the table, but I think it is incredibly informative to start with the fact that we have had a number of states that, in fact, elected Republican senators last week also passed by very large majorities initiatives to increase their minimum wage, including Alaska and Arkansas, who actually flipped their senator from Democrat to Republican, and yet in the case of Alaska, 69% of the voters supported the minimum wage increase. That comports with 13 states in the last year that have passed minimum wage increases in response to the kinds of conditions, and I think because of the kinds of reasons I've just described. In the last year, 13 states, 12 of those states have experienced the same kind of economic growth and employment growth that we've seen in the larger economy. Only one of those states has sort of had moderate growth, and that's Vermont. So that suggests, certainly consistent with the fact that one can have both increased income and beneficial effects or continued beneficial effects in the labor market. Businesses recognize it, and I could just tick off lots and lots of businesses, but I'll start with the fact that the new incoming president of the National Retail Federation—
I'm not sure I'd use the phrase tick off lots of businesses as you make this
yes,
presentation,
sorry.
but
well,
you can continue.
A slip of the tongue, yes. Thank you.
Perhaps.
Thank you. Yes.
You can take the judge out of the courtroom. Go ahead.
I will list some businesses. Gap, Disney, IKEA, Costco, Starbucks have all publicly endorsed the 10-10 minimum wage. The president of the National Retail Federation, an organization that historically has certainly not been a proponent of the minimum wage, came out in favor of the increase to 10-10 and said, let's get over it, let's get on with it, let's have this pass and let's adjust accordingly. Mid-sized firms like Shake Shack, Sweet Green, Boloco, these are eating and drinking establishments, have all embraced the minimum wage. And there are a lot of small businesses that have come forward also saying it's time, it makes sense, let's do this. And then finally, the court of public opinion. It's already indicated by the results of the elections that have been mentioned, but 70% of Americans polled on whether they support the minimum wage answer yes. A majority of Republicans support the increase in the minimum wage. So there's the kind of common sense notion about why it makes sense, why it's fair, and why it is ultimately economically to our benefit, I think, is shown in all of these different wide-scale business support. Historically, the minimum wage has been something where Republicans and Democrats have come together and passed it. We have had increases in the minimum wage in Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, including under President Bush. I would just end by saying this is a sensible policy. This is a timely policy. It's a policy that I think can and should be embraced by a spectrum of our policymakers, and I hope it shall be done very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now hear from Diana, and I hope you will follow the professor's lead in following the dictates of Justice Scalia and not referring to any foreign impacts. This is, we never refer to foreign law. There could certainly not be any globalization impact on raising the minimum wage. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Judge, and thanks very much, David. You know, I'm listening to your remarks, and I'm thinking 10.10 is too low. We should make it the average wage in the economy, which is $24 an hour. Why don't we just raise the minimum wage to $24 an hour? That would be fair to anybody, because why should anybody earn less than average? Well, the answer, as all of you know, is that some people wouldn't have their jobs if the minimum wage was $24 an hour. And it's hard for people in this room to realize it, but there are some people who would not have their jobs if the minimum wage were $10.10 an hour. And in fact, there are people who don't have jobs because the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. The teen unemployment rate is 20%. The African American teen unemployment rate is 30%. Minimum wage workers only represent 3% of employed Americans. Let me say that one more time. Of working Americans, only 3% make minimum wage. But those 3% are primarily young and unskilled, and they need to get their foot on the first rung of a career ladder. Let me tell you a true story about a small business owner called Linda Mack. She's the owner of Silver Cycles in Silver Spring. She describes herself as somewhat left of President Obama. She says President Obama is too conservative for her. But when the minimum wage in Montgomery County went up, as it did recently, to $8.50 an hour, she was very concerned that she was no longer able to offer internships, paid internships, which she was doing, to teenagers, because she just can't employ teenagers at $8.50 an hour. As she told me, I train them, and then maybe the next summer they're worth it, and I give them a raise. But for the initial time that they're working for me, I'm not really making anything out from them. And she's looking at unpaid internships now, seeing if she can work out a program with schools rather than paying these young people. Well, President Obama says there's a moral basis for raising the wage, that no one should have to work full-time and be below poverty level. Well, I would say that there's a moral basis against having a minimum wage at all, including raising it. So $7.25 an hour costs the employer about $8 an hour when you add Social Security, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. What we have now is a law that says if you have skills under $8 an hour, you are not allowed to work in the United States. And we're considering raising that to $10.10, which would mean if you have skills under $11.25 an hour, you will not be allowed to work in the United States. This is positively un-American. There are even people who want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The SEIU, they have a campaign called Fast Food Forward. You can find it on the internet, or Fight for 15. That means if you have skills under $17 an hour, you wouldn't be able to work. That's positively un-American. As you can tell from my accent, I came from England originally, and I was a student in England at Oxford, and my fellow students, during the summer, they would go on unemployment insurance and go on vacation. I would come back to the United States because my parents lived here, and I would have a summer job, the way all my other friends in America did. So I had a series of summer jobs. They had a series of vacations. paid for by unemployment insurance benefits. And I was the one who was better off because I got that experience. I got to be a research assistant at the Center for Naval Analyses, a research assistant at the Urban Institute. To begin with, I worked at Baskin-Robbins, scooping ice cream for $3.25 an hour. I've also worked as a camp counselor. And these jobs have helped me not only decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, an economist and not an ice cream scooper and not in the small business area, but they also gave me a lot of experience. Now, interestingly enough, when we're talking about using the minimum wage to raise people out of poverty, I fully agree that we should not have people who are working full-time in poverty. I agree with the president about that. But we have other programs, so when people work and they are still below certain income levels, we give them resources from other places. We have earned income tax credit. We have food stamps. We have Medicaid. We have housing vouchers. Society gets together to make sure that these people make it and they can still be employed rather than driving them out of employment. Now, these minimum wages were raised in these different states, and I was especially surprised about Arkansas because Arkansas has fairly low median wages anyway. But when a pollster comes to you and the pollster says, are you in favor of raising the minimum wage? Almost anyone with a heart says yes. And that's why I believe the votes went in that direction. Because again, there are very few people who make the minimum wage. But if you were to ask people, would you be willing to pay 39% more for a service that you're paying, that you're buying right now? In other words, if you're paying $10 for something, would you be willing to pay $13 or $14 for it? Most of them would say no. We're talking about one of the largest minimum wages in history. The previous one was about 30%, but this is a very substantial increase. But it's human nature to want to give away money, especially money that you are not paying for and that you don't have. And that's why these minimum wage ballot initiatives have been very successful. I would suggest that minimum wage ballots in the future carve out teenagers and low-skilled workers. They say anyone under 22. It doesn't apply to anyone under 22, and that would be something that I think would at least preserve the option of a summer job for teenagers and low-skill individuals. Doug McMillan, who will take over, who's the CEO of Walmart, started out unloading trucks at a Walmart distribution center. There's all kinds of stories of people who start at minimum wage and work their way up. As an economist, I just wanted to address David's point about increases in minimum wages not having any effects on employment. It's a famous economic study by Card and Kruger, as he mentioned. It was a comparison of fast food restaurants in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey raised its minimum wage and Pennsylvania didn't. And Card and Kruger compared New Jersey with Pennsylvania, which didn't raise the minimum wage. But there are a lot of things that were left out of the Card and Kruger study, and there are a lot of problems with that study. They didn't include information of the portion of employment on the minimum wage, and there's a relatively small portion of employment on the minimum wage. They didn't give any information on whether the minimum wage law was binding and to what extent. They didn't include any information by county, such as income, unemployment, teen unemployment, labor force, and labor force participation rates. And they didn't include any changes in state taxes and franchise fees. Their statistics explain little variance, and practically none of the coefficients are significant. So from that, people infer that increasing the minimum wage makes no difference. But a more likely interpretation is that their equations omitted other important variables. There are other important economists, such as David Newmark of the University of California, who finds that the minimum wage does pose significant effects for teens and for low-skilled workers, just teens and low-skilled workers. I mean, employers know how to reduce turnover. It's really amusing for me that President Obama, who has never run a business, is telling business owners that they can reduce turnover by raising the minimum wage. Well, 97% of workers earn more than minimum wage, and it's not because employers are kind people. It's because that's what they have to pay them in order to get them to stay in the job. Otherwise, they would go to other jobs. Employers already know that if they want to reduce turnover or if they want to keep a certain group of people, then they need to pay more than minimum wage. The Congressional Budget Office, which is the real arbiter on the subject, has estimated that 500,000 people, mostly teens and low-skilled workers, would lose their jobs if the minimum wage rose to $10.10 an hour. And I'd also like to quote from the CBO report about the minimum wage increased earnings. The earnings for low-wage workers would total $31 billion, they say. However, these earnings would not go only to low-income families because many low-wage workers are not members of low-income families. Just 19% of the $31 billion would accrue to families with earnings below the poverty threshold. One reason for this is if you look at the average income of a household with a minimum wage worker, it is $53,000 a year. The average income of a household with a teen minimum wage worker is $62,000 a year. The average income of a household with a minimum wage worker who is not a teen is $42,000 a year. This comes from census data. In general, minimum wage workers are part-time. They are not, in general, supporting a household on their income. And if they are, we have these other resources within society, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the other programs, in order to deal with it. With that, I would like to conclude, and my recommendation is that the minimum wage not be raised. And if there are further minimum wage increase ballots, we should make them just for people 22 and above, so that young people can still get their foot on the first rung of the career ladder, and we don't end up like Europe, where youth and teen unemployment can be 30, 40, 50%. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. We will now hear from Ross, and of course I've given overly brief biographical descriptions of our distinguished panelists. You have the longer and more detailed biographies in your brochures, but I did note that you are a former executive of OSHA, and obviously OSHA costs have no impact on minimum wages, so if you would just speak to that, I'd be helpful.
I won't. I won't try and drag OSHA into this discussion, but I would like to spend a little time just cautioning you that every time Diana said anything about the minimum wage and who earned it, she was talking about the actual $7.25 minimum wage, which is not irrelevant, but it's the smallest part of who would benefit from the minimum wage. As David said, it's not 3% of the workforce, it's 28 million workers would benefit from the $10.10 increase. So, you know, Diana is constantly trying to get you to focus on a part of this that's almost irrelevant, and instead of seeing the real impact of the wage increase. And I think, you know, when she talks about them being teenagers, and, you know, you've already heard from David that the people who earn the minimum wage have an average age of 30. You know, you just have to, you know, keep going back to this. If she's saying, if what she's saying is true, why is it true? Well, it's because she's focusing on 7.25 rather than all the way up to 10.10, all the people who are earning less than $10.10 an hour, and the additional workers who benefit, who make, let's say, $11 an hour, but when the minimum wage goes to 10.10, their employer makes an adjustment to push them farther up. So let me just run through some of the same things David said with a slightly different angle. Why do we have a minimum wage? It's to prevent what FDR called chiseling of workers by employers. Millions of American workers, even with the minimum wage that we have, which is set too low, have so little bargaining power that they aren't earning a decent living, even though they do work full-time, and about half do work full-time, among the people who would be affected by the minimum wage increase. They're a paycheck away from disaster. They have to rely on public assistance. And, you know, if you have worries about big government, it's an odd thing to be arguing that we should be having government pay the wages of these people rather than the employers who are profiting from their employment. And they can't save. They have nothing to save. So leaving wages entirely to the market leads to unacceptable results. The market is amoral, and we are not. And so we want a different result. Most workers, but especially low-wage workers, haven't been rewarded for their increased education or their increases in productivity. You can see all workers are not doing very well. The median worker, isn't on this slide, but you can see that the minimum wage has fallen over time, productivity has climbed. Minimum wage workers are not sharing in that increased productivity. And if they had their minimum wage, the minimum wage would be about something over $16 an hour now if they had shared with increasing productivity in the economy. They've been left behind, they've been left out. And it's not because they are uneducated. In 1979, when the minimum wage was higher, had a higher real value than it does today, 40% of low-wage workers had less than a high school education. Today, people making less than $10 an hour, only 20% of them have less than a high school education. They're better educated. They're also older. About 30% had some college education back then. Today, it's 30% have some college education. So they're not being rewarded for their education, their productivity. Something is wrong. The market is not working for low-wage workers. So another reason we have the minimum wage is that it promotes competition based on something other than driving labor costs down. That it helps increase competition based on productivity and efficiency, customer service and innovation, rather than constantly lowering employee compensation. As David said, it does have positive macroeconomic effects, and this was one of the reasons that was stated by the FDR and Francis Perkins back in 1938. Research by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago suggests that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour would increase economic activity by $22 billion because, as David said, they have a high marginal propensity to spend, minimum wage earners. As Diana said, there's a $31 or $32 billion shift to low-wage workers as a result of raising the wage to $10.10 an hour. And you know, the question was, who could be against this? Well, that money comes from somebody, and it comes from business owners, corporations, and the owners of the businesses. And the net effect is that it slightly reduces inequality. Quoting CBO, as Diana did, they say real income would decrease on net by $17 billion for families whose income would otherwise have been 6 times the poverty threshold or more, lowering their average family income by 0.4%. So, you know, the notion that this is just spread everywhere and everybody, it's not well targeted is not true. In fact, this is a policy that would decrease inequality, would shift some of the huge gains that have been made by the wealthiest among us over the last decades and give them to hardworking, low-wage workers. As I say, it would reduce reliance on public assistance, which we normally think is a good thing. 1.7 million fewer workers would be on public assistance, and that would save the government about the federal government alone, about $7.6 billion a year. The poverty reduction that David mentioned, he said, and it's a figure that our own research supports, 2 million people would be lifted out of poverty. CBO has a smaller number, they say 900,000, but still that's a substantial impact, and anyone who says that this is not targeted to help people in poverty, that might not be its major purpose, but that is one of the important impacts of it. CBO says real income would increase on net by $5 billion for families whose income will be below the poverty threshold under current law. So I think that that is actually fairly good targeting. Now, on disemployment effects, Diana cited the Carden-Kruger study as if that were the only thing that had been done in the last 20 years, suggesting that the minimum wage has insignificant or no disemployment impacts. In fact, there's been an explosion of work, hundreds of studies that have come out and said the same thing, that there is, in fact, an insignificant, small to vanishingly small impact of the minimum wage on employment. And one of the recent studies, many of these are doing exactly what Diana suggested, looking across county borders, all across the country, not in one place, not just looking in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, but looking all across the country. One study looked at every difference across county borders in the U.S. where there was a higher minimum wage in one place or the other, and measured the employment impacts, and found that even on teenagers and restaurant employment, there was no measurable, no significant, statistically significant effect. When you look at more at a sort of a micro level, there's a study of 81 Georgia and Alabama restaurants to see what happened when they had minimum wage increases, and they adjusted. And the study said that they adjusted both because, as David said, businesses adjust to price change inputs all the time, and these are not that big. They're actually pretty modest as a percent of the total cost of running the business. But they did have reduced turnover, and they had other adjustment responses, which included more efficient work from the employees, possibly because they felt better rewarded. In some cases, they raised prices a little. There were increases in consumer demand. There were lots of different ways that the businesses were able to adjust without reducing employment. And the researchers, when they did extensive interviews with the managers of these restaurants, found that employment is considered, reducing employment, either hours or total positions, was considered a costly and counterproductive option, and employers tried to avoid it. And those are among the reasons why you don't see employment effects. I will skip most of the research and wait until questions and answers, but this is a great slide. I'm sure this is immediately obvious to you what this shows. This is looking at thousands, over 1,000 estimations in the research of what the disemployment effect is. And you can see that the results cluster around 0. And what this kind of graph, this funnel graph, the higher you go up, the better, the more reliable the estimate is, either because of the size of the sample or just the confidence level that's obtained in the study. So the best, all of the best, as you can see, all of the most reliable studies show almost no impact at all, 0 or something very close to 0. As David said, there used to be a consensus in the economics literature. That is long gone. If there is, actually I think if there is a consensus now, it's the one that David identified. 7 Nobel Prize winners, 8 former presidents of the American Economics Association joined us in a statement that we put out about the minimum wage, and I will just quote from it to end here. In recent years, there have been important developments in the academic literature on the effect of increases in the minimum wage on employment, with the weight of the evidence now showing that increases in the minimum wage have had little or no negative effect on the employment of minimum wage workers, even during times of weakness in the labor market. Actually, I had one other slide that I do want to show you. This is teenage employment, which, if you believed the notion that the minimum wage somehow controls teenage employment. As the value of the minimum wage has fallen 23% over the years, teenage employment should do what? The labor force participation of teenagers should do what? It should grow, right? Because the minimum wage is having less and less impact, less and less bite. But as you can see, that is not the case. That there's been a 23% decline in the real value of the minimum wage since 1978, and the labor force participation rate of teenagers has fallen 35%. So I think John Challenger of Challenger, Gray, and Christmas has a good explanation for what's going on here. He says, between homework, academic clubs, sports teams, and other activities, many of which are aimed at gaining a competitive edge in college admissions, there is little time left for traditional employment. If the minimum wage were increased, if it had increased with productivity, maybe we'd be persuading more teenagers to work and to spend less time on their studies and these other college activities, but that's not the case. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Karen, as the Executive Director of the National Federation of Independent Small Business Legal Center, and that makes you the representative of the amoral market, would you please go ahead and defend your position as the great Satan here?
Yeah, right, exactly, which is pretty much the reaction I received even back at the ranch, at the office. Oh, how fun for you. You get to go talk about the minimum wage and be against it. But seriously, when it comes to the minimum wage, small business is where the rubber meets the road. Members of the National Federation of Independent Business, with which I'm affiliated, their average employee base is 10 employees or less. Their average annual revenues is $500,000 or less a year. And they have consistently and overwhelmingly opposed an increase in the minimum wage. They believe, based not on computer models or social justice theories, but on their own experience running their businesses, that an increase in the minimum wage will diminish their competitiveness and reduce the demand for labor. First, most small businesses already pay more than the mandatory minimum wage, but those businesses that do not can't. Raising the rate will hurt the businesses that can least afford an arbitrary increase in their operating expenses. They won't grow, they won't hire, and they might not survive. The following hypothetical used by NFIB's chief economist, Bill Dunkelberg, effectively demonstrates the real-world financial pressures the minimum wage places on small business owners. Consider a pizza parlor selling 100 pizzas daily and employing 10 workers at $7 an hour. If they work 2,000 hours a year, the direct labor costs, excluding unemployment taxes, Social Security and Medicare taxes, and those other add-ons, is $140,000, again, for those 10 employees working for $7 an hour. If a minimum wage is forced on it by the government, requiring the business to pay all employees an additional $2 an hour or $9 an hour, that's going to raise their labor bill by $40,000 to $180,000 per year, assuming they're still employing 10 people. But where does the extra $40,000 come from? Well, in the list of organizations that have said that they support raising the minimum wage, Gap, Costco, their financial realities and profits are a lot different than the 10 and unders that I'm representing. And $40,000 for them, I can assure you, is a big deal. And it's unlikely that many of them operating on razor-thin margins are going to be able to absorb it. So cutting it out of their salaries is probably not an option. And they could always, at some point, there's a decision for them, right? Do I really need to do this anymore? I'll just go get another job. They can close their business. There are always alternatives. They could also, as been suggested, raise the prices. So you take that $40,000, you divide that by 365 days, the 100 pizzas this parlor sells, and you're looking at another $1.10 per pizza to recover the cost. But that's going to have to assume that everyone's going to still buy the same number of pizzas at the higher price. And again, there are alternatives out there for their customer base. There are other things they can eat. If fewer pizzas are purchased, the owner might fire an employee or, which is more often the case from what we hear at least anecdotally, just fail to fill a vacant position. So every dollar the workers received due to the higher minimum wage comes out of the pockets of someone. It either comes out of the pockets of the owner or its customers. There is no gain in spending power, as has been alleged. And if a job is lost, that entire income is lost and the associated spending power that comes with it. The bottom line is that employers cannot pay workers more than the value they bring to the business, because otherwise they're going to go out of business. The owner in this hypothetical is forced to pay $40,000 more for the same production. Workers did not suddenly become more productive, producing and selling more pizzas. The higher minimum wage, the harder it is for a young or lower skilled worker to meet this hurdle. A $25 an hour minimum wage sounds great, but the price of pizza and almost anything else would have to go up a lot, taxing customers and owners to pay the costs and leaving total spendable income in the community the same or lower if jobs are lost. But moving beyond hypotheticals, I commend to you an October 5, 2014 editorial in the Wall Street Journal by Andy Puzder. He is the owner of CKE Restaurants, which has more than 200 franchisees running about 2,000 restaurants nationwide. According to Mr. Puzder, his average franchised restaurant employs 25 people and earns $100,000 annually in pre-tax profit. That represents about 8% of the restaurant's $1.2 million in annual sales. Mr. Puzder conservatively estimates that the franchise owner, which is typically the store's general manager, is responsible for 25% of that store's annual profits. The remaining 75% is being made up by the other 24 employees. So each employee contributes about $3,125 per employee to the bottom line profit of the restaurant. If the federal minimum wage was raised 40% to $10.10 per hour as proposed from $7.25, each employee now would earn $3,705 more a year. That is more than $580 that the employee is contributing to the bottom line, to the restaurant's profit. So they're paying the employee, under this proposal, they would be paying his restaurants $580 more per employee than what they are contributing to their bottom line. Again, mandating an employee be paid more does not result in the product or the service automatically increasing a similar amount in value. We hear similar stories all over the nation from our small business owners. The other key takeaway that has already been mentioned on this panel is when the minimum wage is increased, those are not the only jobs that are impacted. If you are giving your lowest paid employees a 40% raise, it is very likely they will be bumping up to the salaries of more experienced employees. This quote-unquote escalator effect, accordion effect, or wage compression, whatever you want to call it, occurs when minimum wages rise. Workers just above the current minimum wage will receive mandatory increases, and those just slightly above that group of employees will also receive increases in order to keep some wage difference between more and less skilled employees. Thus, minimum wage increases affect more than minimum wage employees. The bottom line is that as good as raising the minimum wage sounds, the real-world impacts create some winners, but they also create some significant losers. As we have heard today, an increase in minimum wage will result in some current employees losing their job. But more importantly, job opportunities are lost. The minimum wage sets the hurdle that the new workers must get over to justify being employed in the first place. Workers that bring less value to the firm than the firm is going to be paying them are not going to be employed. As labor costs are increased, employers are incentivized to find ways to use less labor altogether with machines and newer technologies. Raising the minimum wage does not raise income and spending in the local community, as every dollar a minimum wage worker receives comes out of the pockets of local consumers paying in higher prices and may cause some firms to reduce or close their business, reduce employment or close their business. These people spend less. Raising the minimum wage that can be paid to the lowest skilled workers will bump up the wages of those with more skills. And a minimum wage worker starting at $7 an hour typically has a 66% chance of getting a raise in the first year as they prove themselves already. Prices will have to rise to cover the increased labor costs, which make up most of the costs of small businesses. Small businesses are called job creators for a reason. They are very labor-intensive enterprises. Policies like an increased minimum wage discourage them from hiring new workers and creating new jobs, and that is not what our struggling economy needs.
Thank you, Karen. I see from your remarks that you remain a stubborn creationist, believing that businesses create jobs. All right, let us begin with the evolutionists on the panel. David, what are your comments that you'd like to make generally, and then we'll go with Diana, we'll come to Ross, and we'll come back to Karen, and then we'll have the proverbial free-for-all where I get crushed in the middle. You have a question or comment you'd like to address to the panel generally or to one of the others specifically?
Sure, I would, well, I have a number of observations just from Diana and Karen's comments I'd like to make, and I'm happy to be identified as an evolutionist, I guess. I would first make the general observation, if you increase the minimum wage to the average wage, it will no longer be the average wage, but that's an easy statistical point. I would make the more general comment about Diana raised the issue of, well, why not raise it to $24? And clearly, you know, that's just that's a debating point. There will be larger price effects and larger employment effects the more the minimum wage goes up. I think that's, you know, that's Econ 101, and no one's proposing a $24 minimum wage. The minimum wage that is on the table is a minimum wage of $10.10 that's been carefully evaluated as to its impact. So, you know, the arguments about, well, if you believe this, let's go to a $100 minimum wage, I just don't think advance the ball in understanding the issue. I would also say, and also as a former chief economist of my department, you know, I'm sure you would agree with the proposition economic policy is best not made by anecdotes. We need to use the best data we have, statistical evaluation of the best data we have to make informed policy decisions. I think that should cut across, again, the political spectrum. Karen was a bit dismissive of, you know, these crazy economic models. Well, these are statistical models done by serious economists to inform policy. And as both I described and as Ross described, the preponderant evidence from a range of economists, creationists and evolutionists alike, speak to the fact that the effects, the employment effects, are modest. And they're modest for different groups, including young workers, including different demographic groups that have been cited. We have looked at that evidence carefully, and it simply doesn't support the proposition that it would have large employment effects. You know, I think the proposition about, well, there are other forms of social assistance other than sort of think about the poverty level, people who are not able to attain by working full time that level of income, and therefore they should use food stamps and other forms of social assistance, strikes me as a rather odd argument, and certainly doesn't answer the fundamental question about the fact that the current standard puts families in the position that either they're below the poverty level or they're required to use social assistance to get there. The particular fact about the current minimum wage placing families of 17% the poverty level includes the earned income tax credit. So it's adjusting for that, and that again speaks to the problem that I think we have to address. The notion that human nature is to give money away, and that's why people support the minimum wage, I would respond in two ways. Number one is people do think hard, I believe, when they go to the ballot box. It's not just a poll taken randomly on the phone. And one of the things people think about are the implications on their own wallet. And I think I give voters more credit. And voters in all of these states that otherwise elected swung to the right in this election, supported the minimum wage. And I don't think that's something to be easily dismissed. That's a statement of preference. If we believe the voters' preferences in terms of who they picked in the Senate, I think it's a bit odd to dismiss them in terms of their preferences in terms of a referendum like minimum wage. I think Ross spoke quite completely about the fact that there's been an enormous literature since the Carden-Kruger study that have addressed exactly the problems that you've suggested. There has been a very robust discussion in economics because you've had economists like David Newmark taking on those propositions, and that's resulted in this huge literature, again, that I think speaks just dramatically about the importance of the minimum wage as I say, a policy with intended consequences. Let me just say in terms of Karen's comment, I actually put more faith in business than your hypothetical implies. Your hypothetical is premised on the fact that businesses don't adjust to increases in wages. And if that was true, the American airline industry would still be in the red. And what I mean by that is the American airline industry has substantially restructured because jet fuel prices increased over a number of years. And what did they do? They restructured the way they served their customers. They restructured their fleets. They restructured the hub and spoke system. They fundamentally did what we teach in economics is you care about input prices, and you also care about the productivity of inputs. The marginal cost of an input is because of both the price of inputs and the productivity of the inputs. And so what any business does, and what we teach MBAs to do, is in the face of any price shock, you adjust. You restructure business. And that is what the evidence, again, going back to the evidence about how you can have real increases in earnings at the same time as very insignificant impacts on hours and employment says to me is that businesses adjust and they adjust productively, and we can have both the benefits of increased earning power by individuals and the benefits of profitable businesses that have adjusted in the past to minimum wage quite effectively, small and large alike, and would adjust to the 1010 proposal as well. Thank
Diana.
you.
Thanks very much. Well, I would agree that a lot of businesses do adjust. The question is, how do they adjust? If you have to pay someone $15 an hour rather than $7.25 an hour, you are going to hire somebody who is worth $15 an hour. Maybe not immediately, you're not going to fire your whole workforce, but you're going to make changes. The next person you're going to hire is going to have a higher value added for you. You might also add more technology, and we've also seen this throughout businesses. Now there's a chain called Chili's where you order on an iPad. You don't order with a server. You go to a lot of retail stores now, CVS, Safeway, Giant, they have self-service checkout. You go to stores like Lord & Taylor, you can scan a price instead of asking an attendant. So yes, businesses do adjust. And I'm not as concerned as Karen is about businesses. I am concerned about young people who cannot enter the workforce because the wage is too high. There's been some talk about a letter signed by economists. You know, you can get a lot of letters. There's another letter signed by over 300 economists against raising the minimum wage. So economists are not as one-sided on this as Ross makes it appear. In Ross's slide, which maybe he wants to put up again, you can see that the labor force participation rates of teens went down after 2006 dramatically as the minimum wage went up. That's because they dropped out of the workforce because they were discouraged. They couldn't find a job at the high minimum wage, which started going up in 3 different levels between 2007 and 2009. So they stopped looking. It wasn't that all of a sudden they just got more homework. If it's that, you know, if you can increase GDP by $22 billion by raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, I mean, if any of you believe that, I mean, you need to, I don't know what you need to do, but why?
Be careful.
You need to be very...
We don't have Rule 11, but I do have a loud voice.
You need to be careful, because if you can raise it $22 billion by $10.10, I mean, why can't you raise it by 40 or 50 billion by increasing it more? You can't just magically get increases in GDP by requiring employers to pay more money. It just doesn't make any more sense. You need to check your facts. The next time someone asks you and says the minimum wage is too low, you need to ask yourself two questions. First of all, why do some Americans work for a minimum wage? And why do many more Americans covet these jobs? These teens in the summer are looking for jobs. They want them, and they complain because they can't get them. The answer is that these are great jobs, and many young people start successful careers with minimum wage jobs, and it is immoral for us to keep them out of the labor market. Second, would you be equally willing to pay $13.90 or $20 for a service that you pay $10 for right now? If you answer yes, you probably have not mastered the basic laws of economics. Of course, you would not be willing to buy as much of the service for $13.90 or $20 as you do for $10. And that is the crux of the problem. These wage increases are not free. They have consequences. And the consequences are not ones that we want to see here in the United States. We don't want these high youth unemployment rates and high other unemployment rates that we see in other countries that keep people out of the labor market. And just one more point about productivity. People say that if the minimum wage is raised, we will have high productivity. Well, absolutely, that's technically true. I mean, say we had a minimum wage of, just say, $50,000 a year, and the only people who were allowed to work were people who could make $50,000 or more. Output per hour would be very high. So technically speaking, yes, our productivity would be higher, but we'd have all these other people who are unemployed. Those are the kinds of people that I'm concerned about, the kind of people who are left out of the labor market because the minimum wage is raised.
Russ.
Well, let me start with Diana, who thinks that all these kids dropped out of the labor force wanting jobs. In fact, there was a survey done in February of this year asking among the 11 million teens who are not in the labor force, did they want a job? And 8% of that 11 million said they did. So whatever your fantasy is about, them being deprived of jobs, it's not the case. Those teens not in the labor force are not there, almost all of them, by choice.
We use the term vision in the Catholic Church to avoid fantasy. That's certain other.
The teen unemployment rate is 20%.
So,
the African American teen unemployment rate is 30%.
No. Lord Vader is speaking.
Thank you.
You will have another chance to round. Okay, go ahead.
So, and then Diana's entire approach to this is premised on the notion that the market is somehow perfect and people are being paid what they are worth. And it might be the case, and it is probably the case, that there is an inequality of bargaining power that allows employers to get more from their workers than they're willing to pay them for. And that we've let that there is some relationship, and it's not $50,000 a year, but that there's something that someone in the bike shop is doing for the employer, and at $7.25, they're probably being underpaid for the work that they're doing. There's $7.25 really doesn't buy very much. The Dunkelberg hypothetical is an odd way to answer 20 years of economic research that actually studied what happened when there were minimum wage increases, what happened to employment across the country. It's a hypothetical. I mean, the hypothetical pizza place, we could turn to an actual owner of a pizza shop who said that he said, "We know from past and current experience that layoffs and prices do not spike as predicted because of mitigating factors such as increased consumer demand and cost savings from lower worker turnover." He's the owner of a chain of successful pizza restaurants in South Carolina. And it actually occurs to me, and it should occur to all of you, that the NFIB probably speaks very well for its members and reflects their views. And when Karen talks about what does small business think? She's telling you what the NFIB members think. But there are other small business organizations, and there are polls. I have one in front of me. The American Sustainable Business Council polled 550 small business employers and found support for raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour, $10.10 an hour in every region of the country, including the South. 2/3 of surveyed businesses in the Northeast were in favor, and 58% even in the South approved of the president's $10.10 an hour. The head of the South Carolina, this is a small business association, the South Carolina Small Business Chamber of Commerce with 5,000 members, says it's time to get over it, basically. He says the minimum wage will benefit 150,000 employees who will have their wages adjusted. The resulting net $450 million increase in state GDP will be good for small businesses and good for South Carolina. So I think, you know, Karen, I'm sure is reflecting her membership's views. There are other small business organizations, and they have a very different view.
I can certainly say both for Ross and Karen that while I don't know anything about minimum wage and economics, as a federal judge in the Eastern District, I know about families who own pizza shops, but that's another discussion. All right, you may talk about pizza, but avoid those 5 families, and let's talk about your response to what you've heard from all the panelists, not just Ross.
Right. Well, no, and I guess first with regards to what David was speaking of, his example he ran to was the airlines industry. Well, that's a great example to prove that point, but I don't know many small businesses that have 10 employees or less that have an airline company. And that's, again, this is really a perfect example of what the small business owners on Main Street face every day. Again, that is our sweet spot, if you will. That is who we are representing. Regulation disproportionately affects them times, 10 times more than it does the average, big corporation. Similarly, it's the same thing when you talk about labor increases. Again, they can't outsource. It's all inside America where most of their employees are coming from. And they need those employees. They can't always run to the latest and greatest technology because they really are operating on razor-thin margins. So that is how I would respond to both David and to Ross, is that for those Main Street small business owners that are literally, I know many of them, they are not rolling in the dough, they're not going out on their yachts every weekend. They are lucky if they clear $100,000 a year, and most of them, a lot of them actually are significantly under that. So an increase on their labor costs is going to be a real hit out of their pocket.
We're now going to have questions, and we're going to have the first question from former Federalist Society president and distinguished New York attorney Gerald Walton.
Well, thank you. And when my good friend Judge Kuntz asked me if I was going to ask a question, I said I'm not an expert in this field, so I certainly won't. And from a simple-minded non-economist, I am troubled by both Ross's and David's presentations. I know you quote economists, and I also know as a litigator that frankly you can get an expert to say anything. And I know you cited the Nobel laureate economists, but I also know that somebody by the name of Arafat got the Peace Nobel Prize Award. So hey,
nobody's perfect.
I put that aside. And not being an economist, I just rely on a very simple formula, which is that bottom line is the result of taking revenues and subtracting from it expenses, and you get the bottom line. Now, you have said, both of you have said, that raising the minimum wage will also push up the wages of those above. And I think David said it will actually raise the average wage paid by any business. Now, it seems to me that that increases that debit item of expenses. And when you have a business, and it is no answer to say that airlines is the good example, both because of the reason that Karen gave, but also from the reality as a passenger. I know that what has happened when they raised the wages in airlines and extra costs, it was passed on to the passengers who paid for it, either in both in more money for the ticket and for smaller space. And the question I have is, what are the alternatives to a small business other than raising prices, which may put them out of competition, especially if it's in an area that they're competing with China? And secondly, or if not raising prices, cutting labor, such as some of the McDonald-type places are now suggesting using either electronic or robot equipment. And aren't you thereby reducing both the GDP of this country as well as employment opportunities for our younger people?
David, then Russ.
Sure. So I always know you need to be careful when a distinguished judge says something. He has a simple-minded question. I know you need to tread carefully in response to that. I would start by, I do take some exception to say, you know, you can get an expert to say anything. And I think we have to be careful about that, because I think that cuts both ways. We do need to look at evidence carefully, and I know there are a lot of Beltway bandits that live down here. I live in Boston, and I'm only a recent member of your community down here, and I know there are a lot of people who are paid to come up with opinions. But I think we have to look at the preponderance of evidence in any particular situation. And here, I think if you looked at the evidence and the type of economists and the kind of things they write on, it's quite striking about the range of people who have basically come to the same conclusion about the effects of the minimum wage. And it's not, it's sort of like find your favorite expert to say something. And I would point out to you, Milton Friedman also received one of the first Nobel Prizes in economics, as have many other distinguished economists from the right and left. I understand the question you're asking and that Karen posed about small businesses are not airlines. And I would say let's give businesses credit. And what does a small business that employs predominantly labor do? Well, the evidence suggests, and again, this is what not only the evidence suggests, but this is what we teach in business schools. There are a lot of tools available. How you screen workers, who you hire, how you train them, how you retain them, how you move them in the organization. These are all vital tools that businesses have, that businesses respond to in terms of changes in wage costs and labor costs, not only from the minimum wage from public policies, but from tightening of labor markets generally. Labor markets are tightening as our economy recovers, and you're finding businesses doing this kind of thing now. That's why it ultimately results in lower accessions and separations from businesses, because businesses are managing people differently, they're screening people differently, and they're retaining them differently, and that ultimately helps the economy. In the long term, where we have had wage increases, is there capital substitution for labor? Yes, that's what we call economic progress. If you didn't believe that, we wouldn't have less than 2% of our labor force in the agriculture industry. We have gone from probably somewhere close to 60%, 150 years ago. That's the nature of economic progress. There is a logical fallacy that's sometimes called the lump of labor fallacy, like there's nowhere these people will go. A developing economy in the face of changing prices and in the changing productivities and technologies adjusts over time, and we get new industries, we get reallocation of labor, and that's all to the good. And I certainly wouldn't contest that will happen over the long term. In the short term, I think there are actually a lot of opportunities for adjustment, again, because businesses are creative.
Ross, if I can get an amen, you can get the next two questions.
Okay, I'll give a short answer, because if the economic science won't move you, then I'll read you what the owner of the pizza shop who made the adjustment already to $10.10 an hour said about his own experience in his chain of pizza restaurants. As anticipated, the managers reduced turnover and the related costs of training new workers. They also reduced the inevitable costs of inexperienced employees, mistakes, and product waste. Avoiding these expenses more than outweighed the incremental cost of a minimum wage increase. In addition, customers noticed the difference in worker morale and service and became more loyal. There was no need to raise menu prices, and employees are being added, not eliminated.
Can I have a quick
Next.
comment? Can I have a quick response?
You can respond after he asks the next question. You can tag on your response.
A quick comment and a question. The comment is the idea that by using legislative fiat to reallocate resources from employers to employees, I don't see how that can increase GDP any more than taking a bucket out of water at one end of a lake and pouring it back at the other end and assuming that it'll raise the level of the lake. Because obviously you take out of the bottom line of the business whatever you're giving to the employee. Now my question relates to entry-level youth employment. And my concern is not so much about disemployment, but failure to employ. I'm a former president of the Port Angeles Business Association, the town in Washington State where I live. By the way, our minimum wage, state minimum wage, is $9.75 now. So that study that shows the decrease in youth employment next to the federal minimum wage having gone down in real terms doesn't take into account that many states have their own minimum wage, which, like Washington, in some cases substantially higher than the federal minimum wage, and of course employment levels are based on that. What I hear from small business owners in my organization, flower shops, realtors, home builders, gift stores, is they cannot find a job for an entry-level teenager where he contributes $9.75 to their business. They could if they could pay him $5 or $6. So what they do instead, they hire a more seasoned worker. Like your pizza place, Mr. Eisenbrey, it results in more customer satisfaction because that person is a seasoned employee. He already knows how to show up on time. He knows how to dress. He knows how to interact with customers articulately. He delivers a better quality product. My question is, would Mr. Weil and Mr. Eisenbrey support suspending the minimum wage for entry-level employees to allow these kids not so much to make the $5 or $6, but to get the experience to learn to be a reliable employee, to dress correctly, to show up on time, which if they're not offered a job, they're not going to get.
Okay, Diana, you get the first crack at it. Rope in your last answer, and then we'll turn it over to them. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that David, when he said in management school, they teach them how you train workers and who you hire, and that changes when you raise the wage. Well, that's precisely what I was saying. You hire a different type of worker, and you train them differently. But then what if there are some who cannot, as this gentleman was saying, manage to achieve those skills of the higher wage? And you also said economic progress is technology substituting for labor, and that's what we have now in agriculture. But tell that to the people whose jobs are being destroyed. They don't see that right away when the technology comes and takes away their jobs. So the question is, how do we want to help the poor? How do we want to help these entry-level workers? And I would suggest it is by allowing them to work rather than taking the jobs away from them.
Well, no, I wouldn't have a period of time when you didn't pay people for the work that they were doing. And I think that you probably underestimate the cost of turnover, that people don't, I think the Society of Human Resources Management put out a study recently that estimated the cost, even for low-wage workers, the cost of hiring a new employee, going out and advertising, finding the person, interviewing, doing background checks, the whole works is 10% of the annual wage. So there's a substantial savings in keeping people on board. So when this pizza owner talks about reduced turnover, making it possible not to raise prices, this is not hot air. These are real savings that they're talking about.
Karen, and then back
That's why 97% of workers are paid more than minimum wage.
Karen, how do you do that, Karen? It's amazing. Throwing the voice is just phenomenal. Karen.
Yeah, I mean, your experience, again, is very much what we are hearing, and that is, in addition, what the small business owner in many instances is going to do is they may just have to take on those responsibilities themselves to keep operating. Because as I mentioned in my remarks, many times the business owners that are actually still paying the minimum wage, because we talk to a lot of our members that don't. They pay above the minimum wage. They can't pay more for where they are in their business at that time. So that's just going to put the onus on them to do more themselves, or, you know, close shop, or, I mean, it's like the bucket, whoever was saying that, you know, balloon, whatever. You can't make it more than it already is.
David, then Diana, the next question.
Okay. Well, I would just point out, Washington State passed its minimum wage increase in 1998 and indexed it, which is why it's at the level it has. And from the time of 1998 to the present, Washington State has had twice the job growth that the national rate of employment has been. So I think that's also suggestive of something about the impact of the minimum wage on job growth. It's actually been quite the opposite experience at the state level than your example suggests.
Far corner.
My question is for Karen about a possible exemption for small business. And if Your Honor will forgive me, I have to have a little background on it very quickly. I left high school 50 years ago, and I was 18 years old, and I wanted to earn money to go to college. So I went to work making blue ribbon flanges, running a turret lathe and a drill press for half the minimum wage. Now, in the state of Texas, where I'm from, apparently they were allowed an exemption for smaller businesses. So Cameron Iron Works, which is an international company next door, had to pay the minimum wage, whereas I worked for doing the same thing at OTM Corporation for half that amount. I was happy to get that because I'd never seen a machine in my life. So what do you think about trying to go for a small business exemption like we had back in the prehistoric days of 1965?
Well, I mean, I will say again that this is just like regulation. This wages are disproportionately burdensome on the true small business owner. And again, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about your 25 and unders. That said, you know, speaking from NFIB, we don't advocate for exemptions. I mean, we just honestly we think the minimum wage is arbitrary as it is, and so I don't know that the organization.
I agree with you, but it worked in the state of Texas because I can assure you, not many employers in the state of Texas were paying the minimum wage, and Texas was doing just fine.
I thank you for your question. Question here.
Yes, sir. I have challenges both ways. My challenge to David and Ross, the discussion about raising the minimum wage. It seems that the places where, you know, the talk of $15, where the pressure seems to be hottest to raise the minimum wage, is in large cities where you have high rental rates. Are we making the minimum wage really bear the failure of municipalities and regions to zone and control their housing in a manner that people who work at places like McDonald's can pay rent? So that's my challenge to you, and my challenge to Diana. You make the argument that that the presence of social supports like food stamps, and you'd mentioned housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, that these are there to make up for the to assuage the poverty. At my agency, we've dealt with people who are on the Section 8 wait lists. The wait for these vouchers is upwards of 3 years. How do you square the argument that these programs are there and available and are the counterpart to not raising the minimum wage?
We have your questions. We'll get the response. Bang, bang. Go ahead.
Well, I would say, first of all, you have to distinguish the arguments for a federal minimum wage from state or local efforts to raise the minimum wage above that, and often the justifications are for some of the reasons you stated. In terms of the policies I'm talking about is what makes sense at a national level in terms of a minimum wage that reflects overall national conditions, and that's where the 1010 number comes from. I just briefly say, I was asked to address the Conference of Mayors this summer about the minimum wage issue, and it was a roundtable of probably about 60 different mayors from around the country, Republican and Democrat alike, And the interest in raising and thinking about a local minimum wage, I thought was striking, one that I couldn't predict by figuring out which mayor was on the Republican side and which was on the Democrat side, because of some of the things you've described in terms of local responses to different cost structures.
Diana?
The advantage of using social programs as a safety net rather than forcing employers to pay higher wages is that it doesn't keep people out of the labor market. It also distinguishes between people who on the minimum wage while supporting their families from teens who are not supporting families and are in households earning on average $62,000 a year. So that's the major advantage. The important thing is if we are going to help people who are poor and have low skills, we need to get them into the labor force as soon as we can, get them to hold a job, and then they can change jobs and move up the career ladder. Practically no one who goes to McDonald's expects that to be a lifetime job. Just as when I was scooping ice cream in Baskin-Robbins, I didn't expect that to be a lifetime job. It enabled me to get to the next stage.
Final question, because Dean has just given me a signal that if you get in Brooklyn, it means you sleep with the fishes. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question predominantly for Mr. Eisenbrey, but respond as well. You spoke a lot about businesses who, presumably some larger businesses perhaps, but different sized businesses that can respond to the minimum wage change without much difference. Costco has mentioned other businesses that are willing to raise the minimum wage. Well, fine, perhaps they could without federal laws. My question is, what is your moral justification for imposing this on businesses, whether or not they can accept the cost against their better judgment?
All right.
Well, I could quote you from Franklin Roosevelt, whose administration came up with the Fair Labor Standards Act. He said, no business which depends for its existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. And by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. So I think that was the mindset of the people who passed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. It didn't apply then to the smallest businesses, and in fact, it doesn't today. There are exceptions for small businesses and businesses that are not in interstate commerce. But I think the premise of the question, when we've shown so much evidence that the minimum wage doesn't really have the disemployment effects that people fear, think of your restaurant that's worried about this. If it has to raise its prices, everybody else does too. Everyone has to pay the minimum wage, not just that restaurant. So its competition is in the exact same position. Why do you think it's going to go out of business? Because it's doing what everybody else has to do. I think the very premise of the question is just wrong.
Karen? Nope. Karen?
Well, that's interesting because that is a good point, that everybody else is going to have to do the same thing. But again, not everybody is the same in the small business space. The smaller folks are not going to have as many levers to work with to make adjustments on their models. So the little, Five Guy burger joint is going to be impacted more than a Red Robin or a national chain. I don't know how else to say it.
David, and then Diana. You get the last word.
Well, I would actually go back to something Diana said, which is about adjustment to changing technology. And I would certainly, maybe we found some common ground here, I would certainly embrace that one of the important roles of government is to help people adjust in those times as we're switching from one technology to another. And so perhaps, as I say, we found some common ground here.
I don't think so, because I was against this forced change in technology that puts people out of work. I would say about everybody has to raise the minimum wage, all restaurants. Well, that means fewer people go out to dinner because all the prices rise and you don't go out to dinner as much, so all the restaurants do worse, and people switch. And if, Ross, you're talking about FDR's time, as you know, the economy did so great during FDR's time, and unemployment actually rose during his administration. So I think that's an example against it rather than in favor of it.
Well, all I will say is I want to ask each of you to thank our distinguished panelists who are quite knowledgeable. We could obviously have gone on at greater length, but I want to thank them for their patience and your patience. Very well done, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you, Jerry. Take care. I'll see you back in the hearing. Thank you so much.